Hello and welcome to Firecoder. This is part 2 of the MySQL InnoDB Cluster series. In this part 2, we're going to configure MySQL instances and create InnoDB Cluster. In the previous part 1 of the MySQL InnoDB Cluster series, we have installed MySQL Server and created multiple instances of it, having different port numbers. So we have 3 instances of MySQL Server running on our machine. The MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3306 is going to be our primary instance in the cluster, and the MySQL instances having port numbers 3307 and 3308 will be secondary instances of our InnoDB cluster. To configure these instances, we need one server configuration account. Each of these MySQL instances must have this server configuration account with the same username and password. You can also create administrator accounts to manage the server instances after the cluster has been set up. You can have one or more administrator accounts. You can have one or more MySQL router accounts for the MySQL router instances to connect to the cluster. To create multiple instances of MySQL Server, we initialize the data directory for those instances. Let's take a look at the databases available after initialization. Let's connect to MySQL instances and see the databases. First, we want to change the directory path to point to MySQL binaries so that we can execute MySQL command. Copy the path and change the directory to point to MySQL binaries. Connecting to MySQL Server that's listening at port number 3306. Enter the password. Show databases. We have the MySQL system databases and user created databases. Let's quit this connection and connect to the instance that's listening at port number 3307. Enter the password. Show databases. If you notice that we have only the MySQL system databases after initializing the data directory. Now let's connect to MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3308. Enter the password. And for this instance also we have the MySQL system databases only. Now we can install MySQL shell, which provides admin API to configure and manage InnoDB cluster. It takes quite some time to install. Please be patient. So we have installed MySQL shell. Click finish to install. Now we can configure MySQL instances. Open MySQL shell. Configure MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3306. We're trying to configure the instance using root account. Although we are not going to use the root account to configure the instance, this will give us options to create another account to configure the MySQL instance. Hit enter. As you can see, this instance reports its own address. The user root can only connect from localhost, which is not what we needed. So we are going to create a new account. For that, we're going to select the second option, type 2 and hit enter. Now we can create a new account to configure the MySQL server for usage in InnoDB Cluster. IC root is the account name and give a password. Confirm the password. So here are some configuration options that needs to be fixed. It's asking for do you want to perform the required configuration changes. Type Y. We want to perform the required configuration changes. Type Y and hit enter. It is asking, do you want to restore the instance after configuring it? Yes. Type Y and hit enter. The user account has been created successfully and the instance has been configured for usage in InnoDB Cluster. Check the instance configuration. dba.check instance configuration and give the account name. Hit enter. The instance is compatible with InnoDB Cluster and is a valid one for usage in InnoDB Cluster. Configure the second instance that's listening at port number 3307. dba.configure instance. Here also we're trying to configure the instance using root account. Configuring MySQL instances using root account is not recommended for security reasons. So the instance reported its own address. The root can only connect from a local host. Select the second option to create a new account to configure this instance. Give an account name and password. Enter the password. Do remember the server configuration account name and password must be same for all the instances that joins the cluster. We have created the account and configured the instance. Now we can check the instance configuration. The instance is valid to be used in the InnoDB cluster. Then we're going to configure the third instance, that's listening at port number 3308. Again, trying to configure the instance using a root account, which will give us options to create another account to configure the instance. Select the second option, type in 2 and hit enter. Give an account name and enter the password. Confirm the password. For this also we have to fix some configuration options. Type in Y and hit enter. We want to restore the instance after configuring it. Type Y and hit enter. The account has been created successfully and the instance has been configured. Let's check the instance configuration. The instance configuration is compatible with InnoDB Cluster and is valid to be used in InnoDB Cluster. Now we can connect to one of the instances to create InnoDB Cluster. In our case, we're going to connect to MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3306. We're connected to MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3306. We're ready to create InnoDB cluster. Start dba create cluster. Give a cluster name. If you want to create multi-primary InnoDB cluster, you can specify multi-primary option. It takes a boolean value true or false. We're going to create a single primary InnoDB cluster, which is the default one. Hit enter. A cluster has been successfully created. Let's check the status. Cluster.status. The cluster is not tolerant to any failures. We have one instance in the cluster, the primary instance, which allows read and write operations. Now we can add 2 more instances to the cluster. Cluster.add instance. Play 307 and hit enter. The safest and most convenient way to provision a new instance is through automatic clone provisioning. So we're going to select that recovery method as clone. The clone process has finished and the instance was successfully added to the cluster. Get the status of the cluster. We have two instances in the cluster, one primary instance and one secondary instance having read-only operations. The cluster is still not tolerant to any failures. Add one more instance to the cluster that will make the cluster tolerant to one failure. The safest and most convenient way to provision a new instance is through automatic clone provisioning. Type in C and hit enter. The instance was successfully added to the cluster. Get the status one more time. Cluster dot status. Now we have 3 instances in the cluster. The cluster is now tolerant to one failure. So we have created a cluster. Now we can set up an admin account to manage the InnoDB cluster. Cluster.setup admin account. Give an account name. Enter the password for the account. Confirm the password. We have created admin account for the cluster. Also we can set up a router account. If you have router installed, you can set up router account. Call cluster.setup router account method to create a router account. Now let's connect to the instances and see the databases after clone provisioning. First, let's connect to MySQL instance that's listening at port number 3306. Enter the password. So we have the MySQL system databases and the user created databases as well. Now let's connect to the instance that's listening at port number 3307. As you can see, during data directory initialization, we didn't have that user created databases, but after clone provisioning, we had that Sekila and world databases in the databases. And finally, Here also we have the user created database to clone provisioning. Now let's do the testing for group replication. So connect to the primary instance, which is the only instance that allows write operations. Create database, test, show the databases. We have the test database in the databases. Quit that connection and connect to other two instances and see if we have the test database. As you can see, we have the test database replicated to this instance as well. Connect to the instance listening at port number 3308. And here also, if you notice that we have that test database in the databases.